Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. My name's David Cleary. It's an honour for us all to be kicking off this couple of days of sessions. And our first session, we're going to look at the question of deforestation. And we're at a really fascinating moment, I think, historically. The whole issue of deforestation and land conversion was visible as never before at COP26 in Glasgow. We have since then, there's legislation is being considered in the US, the UK, and the European Union. And we haven't had this critical mass of attention catalyzed, I think, by the linkages between deforestation and climate change in the 20 odd years that, there's 50 odd years that the accumulated experience of panelists working on this issue represents. Of course, here is the agricultural frontiers, where the issue is actually happening. What can the risk that we see and that has often happened in the past is that you get segregation of supply chains. With demand from more responsible actors and consumers being met from relatively consolidated production landscapes where deforestation is not so much of a question. Certification is one kind of example that, certification is one classic example that can lead to segregated supply chains. So we're going to examine that question. We've got a great panel. We've assembled it to represent different perspectives from around the world, perspectives from China, from Brazil, from the UK, and the European Union. Let me just spend a couple of minutes explaining how we're going to work. I'm going to lead a moderated discussion that's going to last for about 40 to 45 minutes. We're then going to take questions and debate with the audience. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A function. Can you please put questions to the panelists into that Q&A function? You can address the question to all of the panelists, or you can address them to individual panelists, and I will use that to throw at the to organize the debate. Please be as provocative and frank as you like. We want a straightforward and honest discussion that can go straight to the issues, no matter how controversial or difficult they are. So, Toby, let me begin with you. Can you just give us a quick high-level overview of what Europe's conversion and deforestation footprint is, to what commodities, what producer countries, what the current trends are?
Yes, thanks very much, David, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. The EU is the second largest importer of tropical deforestation and associated emissions. However, it's worth noting that the embedded impact of deforestation in its imports halved between 2005 and 2018. But during that period, the EU was associated with approximately 2.7 million hectares of deforestation. Now, even with that reduction in 2018, the latest data that we've analysed, international trade overall was associated with just over 1 million hectares of tropical deforestation, and the EU was responsible for some 13% of that, which makes it second only to China in international markets. And if we look at the commodities that are most linked to that deforestation, more or less in this order, we're looking at palm, soy, coffee, beef, cocoa, rubber, and maize. So beef is not at the top of the list, which it is for other places, but palm oil is approximately twice as much as the next commodity for the embedded footprint of the European Union. But it's also important in the context of this landmark regulation that's coming through, which has the potential, of course, to drive changes in other legislation elsewhere. We need to look at what's actually being encompassed. Analyses that we've done using MapBioma's data from Latin America shows that under the current definition of forests, as applied under the draft regulation, it would leave unprotected the majority, about 75% of the Brazilian Cerrado, 80 million hectares, and a third maybe of the Chaco, the tropical dry forest biome that stretches across Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia. And it's precisely in these areas that Europe is actually importing much of its commodity. So there's a risk, therefore, that buyers looking to comply could be encouraged to turn to areas that are excluded and exacerbating the problem there. However, there is great opportunity to change this. If the legislation was adjusted, its definition of forest to encompass lands that the FAO considers to be other wooded areas, then the protection of the Cerrado alone would increase from a quarter to over 80%. So there's a lot to look at there, but that's a bit of an overview, David, for now.
Great, thank you, Toby. Schengen, if I could turn to you. So along with the EU, China is the other major importer of forest risk commodities. So can you give us a sense of where the conversation is in China? I mean, how aware are Chinese consumers and companies of the question, and how much attention is the Chinese government paying to it?
Great, okay. Before I do that, I just wanted to share with you that here in China, they do pay attention to forestry. For example, China actually is one of the largest countries that have planted lots of trees, for many reasons, grain for grain, and lots of policy to encourage tree planting in China. So general citizens are aware of the importance of forestry in protecting our environment, in protecting our biodiversity. But globally, I think the top leaders are committed. We know that China actually signed the Zero Deforestation in Glasgow. You can see the top level policymakers are really committed. But as anything else here in China, this sort of top-down commitment will take some time to filter through the whole society. Now, the researchers like us are very much aware. We are really tracking, monitoring, and let's say working with others, with you guys to see, hey, what are the important issues globally? Now, the companies are beginning to be aware. For example, multinational companies, including some of the tropical commodity importing companies, so they begin to be aware of the issues, the global issues, also local issues in Brazil, in Indonesia, and in Southeast Asia. Now, the citizens probably are the ones who are really left behind. They simply do not know what's going on globally. So they really don't know what they eat or what they consume really matters to not only forestry here in China, but also forestry in other countries. But I can tell you, different stakeholders have sort of different degrees of understanding of the global issues. Now, in terms of, let's say, forestry risk commodities in China, the largest one is soybean imported from Brazil, and beef from Brazil, or palm oil from Indonesia, some other Southeast Asian countries. The timber was an old issue before, right? Timber and wood products. China used to import quite a bit from Southeast Asian countries in manufacturing furniture and then re-export them to Europe, to US, and others. That issue, to me, it's very much be aware by many stakeholders. But food commodities, soybean, beef, palm oil is imported palm oil for, let's say, for cooking, for food processing, and so on. So I think gradually, the different stakeholders begin to be aware of that issue. But more needs to be done. So that's the latest knowledge I can share with you on, let's say, different stakeholders' understanding of the, let's say, forestry risk commodities.
Thank you, Schengen. Leander, if I could turn to you. You're somebody who tracks deforestation trends and commitments made by companies very closely. Have those commitments been useful?
Good morning, everyone. Well, the short answer to that is they do. They do really make a difference. But there is a long answer that it's complicated to assess the real impact of those commitments. The thing is that the commitments is not just the statement that they are going to prevent reduce deforestation, but we are really reducing deforestation in the areas that are really at risk. The commitments is really affecting the areas that are most important. And the thing is that there are just a few commitments that are fully implemented, And for those, we can really check if there is a lot of impact. There is one of the best examples is the Amazon soil moratorium in the Brazilian Amazon. And there are studies that showing that in the first 10 years of the commitment, we prevent deforestation of 1.8 million hectares of Amazon forests. So those are really important numbers, even for the commitments that have issues like the beef commitments, where you have issues with indirect suppliers. It's very clear that at least in the beginning, they were very important to reduce overall deforestation in the Amazon. So they really do reduce deforestation. But the thing is that you always need to be tracking what's going on and making tweaks and adjustments of the commitments that should really make a difference.
Thanks, Leandro. So Natalie, if I could turn to you as an expert on the regulatory and legislation side. So right now we have regulatory initiatives happening in the UK and the European Union and the US actually around embedded deforestation. So could you just walk us through them and just explain the different approaches that each of these players is taking?
Yes, of course. Good morning. So in the EU, they had conducted a series of assessments and consultations, really trying to address, as we're aware, that the fact that the New York Declaration has not been implemented well, so they felt like there was a need for regulation. And in November last year, a proposal was put forward by the European Commission for a regulation on deforestation-free products. It's limited to some specific commodities, which are the major drivers of deforestation. And it has an approach of both zero deforestation after a cutoff date of the 31st of December 2020, and products should comply with national laws. It specifies in quite detail what's required in terms of due diligence for companies, and it applies to all goods placed on EU markets, so it's not just imported goods, to be even, and it requires a geolocalization coordinate, so the actual point of all plots of land where products were produced. So there's quite specific requirements. As a complementary proposal, last month, there was a new proposal adopted, which is more broad about corporate sustainability due diligence. So it's doesn't specify any specific commodities, but it applies only to larger companies, which should conduct due diligence both for environmental and social impacts of their supply chains. In the UK, the Environment Act was introduced last year, though there is going to be secondary legislation that will go into the details of what's exactly in scope. There was a consultation that just ended last week. But it requires larger businesses in the UK to implement a report on their due diligence for the key forest risk commodities, which they'll decide on any land that was production that was illegal. And so the details on what's in scope have yet to be determined, but it will probably focus on just a few of the major commodities. And at the same time in the US, the last regulation is called the Forest Act, which was introduced by Senator Schutz, and that stands for Fostering Overseas Rule of Law and Environmentally Sound Trade. And the aim of it is to restrict access to US markets for any commodities originating from illegally deforested land. And they have a scope of, the major commodities: palm oil, soy, cocoa, cattle, rubber, and wood pulp. And quite similar to the EU regulation, there's a framework and requirements for specific details. But I should add also that in all these regulations, the idea is that they should accompany support in producer countries to enable production that complies with the regulations. But what we're not yet aware of is exactly how that will work and what it will mean. And all so all these regulations require refinement, and so we have yet to see exactly the final lettering of what they'll mean for companies.
Thanks, Natalie. So with that, all of that as the sort of general background, let's start diving into some of the details here. So Toby, let me start with you. So you lead Trace, which is a classic example of how high-tech and imaginative technology can help people understand supply chains and increase transparency there. So technology has advanced to the point where we know exactly where the problem's happening, but how do you make sure that companies engage in those high-risk areas instead of just redlining them and walking away?
This is indeed the million-dollar question that lies in the heart of much of what we do and has taxed us for some years. Bottom line is we need the good guys, if you like, responsible actors to engage positively in these hotspots and help turn red areas green. So that's the prize. And there are many things that can help shift that dial, but I'll just highlight a few. Ultimately, I want to emphasize that we shouldn't care about the deforestation linked to a given company, but instead what's happening on the ground as a function of the actions of all of the market actors that are trying to help turn this around. And to achieve this, my big picture answer to start with is we need to move from what I consider to be a nearly obsessive focus on individual fragmented supply chains and bring incentives that encourage a move from deforestation-free supply to deforestation-free suppliers, such that verified deforestation-free suppliers can then operate with confidence and with integrity and transparency in these higher risk regions, giving confidence to buyers. So how do we incentivize that? There's many things that could be done, but I'll highlight three. First is information on two levels, both information that's needed for companies to achieve compliance in high risk regions, so for them to get onto the level, and information that companies themselves need to be able to disclose to demonstrate that they're compliant across their supply base. And the first, what's needed in order to achieve compliance, requires oftentimes governments helping make available credible data that can allow plot level traceability to take place, especially when it involves indirect supply, which is widespread feature of most commodity supply chains. And some key data sets there that are essential is around property boundaries, ownership registries, crop maps as well, and deforestation maps that can be overlain and agreed as the legitimate source of information about what change is happening. All of those data do not need to be put in the public domain, but they need to be available for businesses to be able to have confidence with each other. The second, so the information that companies need to disclose to demonstrate compliance, requires that the implementation of due diligence legislation, such as what Natalie was laying out for us, needs to take a strategic approach in tailoring the information requirements that are needed to demonstrate deforestation-free supply in different regions, such that the effort behind that due diligence effort can be targeted to where it can drive the greatest benefits. And we in Trace have a policy briefing coming out precisely on this point tomorrow that you can read more details on in our website. But it's really about trying to get the most out of the information that's required to demonstrate deforestation-free supply in driving down deforestation. And thirdly, the transparency that comes with all of that needs to be able to be used to reward companies that are demonstrating compliance and can be used to celebrate cases where we do have examples of upgrading, if you like, of high-risk regions to medium or low risk, that can be called out and celebrated. So that's information. And very briefly, there's two other big levers. One is finance. Deforestation-free suppliers need to be given better credit and financing conditions. I think we can all agree there. But critically need to be prepared to partner during a transition. So we talk about bifurcation of markets, but of course there's a grave risk of bifurcation of finance as well. So this requires that responsible investors are prepared to stay the course and are prepared to follow through with good enough data to understand if progress has been achieved. And finally, I'll add that enforcement around agricultural expansion is key here. So we talk about high-risk regions. What won't work is if efforts to bring down deforestation in frontiers is just negated by the expansion of frontiers elsewhere. So unless the available stock, if you like, of land that's available for expansion is limited in some way, we will chase our tails to a certain degree, and efforts to bring down deforestation in one place will risk being offset elsewhere. I'll leave it there. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Toby. Natalie, kind of like the same question to you, but approaching it from the regulator's standpoint. So what do regulators need to do to ensure that they don't just close off their markets to commodity exporting countries like Brazil and Indonesia? And they'll, in the same way as Toby was just describing, will maybe go elsewhere to other less demanding kind of destination countries.
Right. Well, I would just say I totally agree with everything Toby mentioned. If that all happened, that would certainly make things easier. I think the role of regulators should be to, as I mentioned, all of these regulations are under adjustment and they are looking at how to align, but specifically to ensure that they're supportive of each other, that they don't add undue burden and sort of 3 different systems, or that every country has different requirements, but also that they try and align with what's existing on the ground, and are cognizant and try to support efforts where there isn't available data, or for legal compliance, for example, the details of what that means hasn't been drawn out. So they've got to figure that out and make sure that it doesn't exclude producers. So for example, when they say they require production to be legal, many smallholders, as everyone I'm sure is aware, don't have land tenure, or if they don't have the rights or even a way of geolocating or setting out their boundaries, how can they demonstrate that they're in compliance with national laws? And so there are opportunities to get around. There's some proposals to avoid exclusion like that, but that's one concern. And also looking at how they can provide some incentives and benefits. I think, as Toby mentioned, and I pointed out, that a number of these regulations are supposed to go hand in hand with support. So really understanding what the needs are. And then in terms of the checks, some of this sort of cleaner supplier issues could be very helpful in improving the efficiency of the systems involved, so that you could sort of reduce a lot of effort and expense being paid into actually segregating and tracing everything that could better be used actually on the ground or providing support. So all of those are potentially options. And then I should just say the last thing is just about, Toby mentioned this, but transparency and data availability is really important. So the EU has planned to set up an observatory that's supposed to be a hub for providing data, but it's unclear exactly what that will be providing and to who. And it's also important to understand and support producer governments, as Toby mentioned. Many have data, but it's not always available. And so finding ways to support processes and align with producer governments would be really helpful. And I should just add that in the EU, they've been working with the cocoa sector in West Africa. They've had a series of talks and alignments. And so that type of dialogue, I think, has proved very useful to make sure all relevant stakeholders are aware of what the regulations are going to mean and can provide some input about how they can help ensure that they operate effectively and don't just end up in the EU sort of cherry picking specific markets.
Yeah. So Leandro, if I could dive into that problem of exclusion with you a little bit. I mean, you know that there've been strong reactions against deforestation commitments by farmers in Brazil and Indonesia. And in Brazil, for example, farmers argue that, well, if I'm legally producing and the legislation is quite rigorous, which in Brazil's case it actually is, what's the issue? So how can we make sure that those producing legally aren't penalised, and how can we get farmers on board with the transition towards deforestation-free production?
Well, those mechanisms that need to have 3 things to try to bring the farmers on board. So the first thing, that they cannot be unfair. They need to be well communicated, and they need to be implemented with a set of incentives that incentivize the farmers to keep the forest on their farms, and also change the business decisions for the future. So this mechanisms cannot, the commitments cannot be unfair. So the farmers cannot feel punished for things that they do in the past in goodwill. So we cannot try to solve everything about deforestation with the commitment, but just to address the future deforestation. So not punish farmers to do things that they are usually doing. It needs to be really well communicated. The commitments are not as straightforward as people think. It's hard to translate what the impacts are caused by the commitments to the farmers. So the commitments need to be very well communicated. Regarding the incentives, we need to understand exactly who is going to lose. So the commitments are not going to affect all the farmers, and that's very important to understand. We did an assessment for a commitment, a zero deforestation commitment for farmers in the Cerrado, in the soy supply chain, and we realized that only something like 7% of the farmers would be directly affected. So you need to work with those 7% and not all the entire universe of farmers there. That can need to come with a package of incentives. So for the farmers that still have a natural vegetation in their farms, you need to create some incentives to them to go beyond legal and not deforest those areas. And for the farmers that are expanding, you need to create incentives to direct that expansion for areas that are already converted and not to new areas, to areas with native vegetation, and try to create economic incentives that is going to be more profitable to convert, I don't know, another types of land use that are not as productive, instead of cutting new areas and expanding the frontier.
Thanks. So Shengen, if I could turn to you, how do you see China playing a role here? What's the best way that you see for China to be working with the EU and the UK on these, and the US on these kind of issues?
I do think right now there's a political will for China to work with others, with the Europeans. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Yes. I think the three levels. One is G2G, the government. I think the UK government, the European, the EU government, and the Chinese government have worked together very well during the COP26. Many agreements have been signed between US and China, and obviously the zero deforestation agreement. So you can see G2G does work. I hope that relationship will further strengthen. Number two is B2B, business and business. Here, I think Chinese companies are not behind. I think the European companies need to bring them along to really show them what would be the best practice. How can they change their behavior, whether their procurement policy or the way of doing business. So I think there's a huge opportunity for the Europeans to show the Chinese companies. Chinese companies so far have not been performed very well. Mm-hmm. So number three is actually R2R, research to research. I'm one of the researchers. I think there's great potential for the Chinese researchers to work with, let's say, European researchers, Brazilian researchers, to find the best practices, increase productivity of existing land. I think many mentioned that we need to increase the land productivity of existing agricultural land, do not expand new land. And there's a huge potential to do that. In PRAPA, Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, Chinese Academy of Sciences, another European universities, Wageningen, the UK, many. And there's great potential to share the knowledge, data, best practices. I'm not sure about the citizens, citizens, C2C, I don't see, I think civil society could actually play a role there too. So I have seen that already. So when I came back to China from 35 years working experience in US, I realized that actually China has lots of civil society that are working on environmental issues, on natural resource protection. So suddenly I dropped into a gold mine. So I do think the civil societies here in China can also play a very critical role by working with UK, with the Europeans, with the US, for example. TNC actually has office here. I wish there are many more like that. Going back to you, David.
Thank you, Schengen. So could I just ask people, I'm just looking at the Q&A as we get into these these questions, please feel free to put questions in there. You can put questions to individual panelists or address questions to panelists as a whole. And they can be factual questions or more sort of theoretical or political questions, up to you. We have a really strong group of participants in the audience here, so please don't hold back. So to try and tee up some of those questions, let me end with a final round of questions where I'm going to try to be a little bit deliberately provocative, because I know all of the panelists rather well, so I hope they'll forgive me. So Natalie, let me start with a provocative question for you, which is, we know that not all supply chains lead to Europe and China, and we also know that the single biggest driver of deforestation at the commodity level is the cattle and the cattle industry, beef and leather. Now, most of beef production gets consumed domestically within producing countries. Not all supply chains lead to export supply chains. So are we kind of missing the ball by focusing so much on international trade flows and not as much as we should be on national trade flows?
Well, certainly in the cattle sector, focusing on national consumption, domestic consumption is important. There are efforts in most countries where there's a risk, especially in South America, from cattle driven deforestation, though of course they could be accelerated if they had market signals. But I think that the international regulations and demand can play an important role. Firstly, at least for example, in Brazil, even before COVID, domestic beef consumption was actually reducing by about 3%. Obviously, it's variable, but we see it's obviously the expansion of agriculture that's driving deforestation, and the expansion in terms of sales was heading towards exports. And so it does have sort of an important role in the expansion. So international markets are important there. And then also just with leather, 80% of leather is for the export market. It's high value. For meat packers, it's an important part of their profitability. In fact, we find that most meat packers wouldn't make a profit if it weren't for the non-beef sales. Of course, price volatility is big. So there is a role that can be played, but obviously, in addition to the supply chain actors that we've heard, right, investors, international companies present in domestic markets can also play a role. And then all of the efforts with supporting, nothing will change unless things change on the ground, and therefore supporting forest governance and supporting transparency is going to help all markets and all production efforts.
Thanks. Schengen, if I could turn to you. It's fair to say, I think, that the Chinese government is unlikely to go beyond checking compliance and the question of legal deforestation. That's different from the approach the EU, for example, is taking. So do you think that focus on illegality alone is likely to be enough?
I think for the domestic deforestation, China has already done it. China business for many years. In fact, they're planting more trees. But whether they can do globally, China always try to respect other countries' sovereignty. That's the issue for them. They're not going to say, hey, we're not Brazilians here, you stop cutting trees, or Indonesians. So they're not going to do it. But how they're going to do it, I think they should encourage researchers to work with Indonesians, with Brazilians, to find solutions at that level to stop deforestation. Not at the Chinese importing data. It's not a big one. Also, multinational companies. I do think the Chinese multinational companies can work with Europeans, with others, to learn from them, share the data, share the information, use a digital tool to track, monitor the products they have imported or they're going to import. That will probably make much more sense and probably much more productive instead of introduce an legislation in Congress or somewhere that you have to stop importing a product that have, let's say that affected the forestry in a tropic country. which is rather difficult to apply anyway. But I think from a more sort of practical solutions from other angles will be much better.
Thank you. Toby, so consumers we know don't want higher prices. Companies we know don't want to increase their costs. And we also know that even though deforestation's shooting up the sort of policy agenda, it's still not as important and will perhaps never be important to governments as health issues and education. So how do we fund the incentives that the farmers are going to need in Indonesia and Brazil? You talked about the mobilizing the finance sector beforehand. Well, how exactly are we going to be doing that?
Thanks, David. Another $1 million question. My first part of the answer is to challenge a little bit the premise of the latter part of your question, because there's a lot of deforestation activities that come through subsidies that lower the costs of occupying and opening up new land. So removing or abating some of those subsidies can reduce deforestation and also improve national budgets, the health of national budgets at the same time. So it's important we keep that in mind. But the question of who pays and what the costs are and how those costs are shared equitably, critically, more important than the actual overall cost, I think, is indeed the elephant in the room of much of the discussions we've had for the last few decades. And we need to, first of all, recognize, I think, that commodities are cheap because of externalities, and nobody's going to pay, businesses are not going to pay higher prices to cover higher costs unless they are required to. And then, in turn, for it to become profitable for them to do so. And there are a number of levers that can reset the calculus to make it advantageous, if not fundamentally necessary, to invest in making businesses more sustainable. But I'd also want to emphasize that it's not necessarily about funding in incentives, but also making alternatives that are unsustainable, less fundable or unfundable. So some of those levers. First, what we've been discussing throughout much of the session today is regulation. Regulation is absolutely key to level the playing field by restricting market access and squeezing out the competitive advantage of those companies that are engaged in unsustainable practices, and making it therefore economically viable and attractive to then attach a fair price to sustainable products and ensure that any additional returns are fairly distributed. And the e-regulation and associated efforts in other places are an important and welcome step in that direction. You mentioned financing. So obviously financing can make a big difference. And there's just so much that can be done on making financing conditional on demonstrating progress against requirements. There are vast amounts of public funds that can be adjusted in not very substantial ways, but with huge impact on the ground, with better terms being offered to companies that are showing themselves to be more sustainable. And if you combine those elements of market access and financing, possibly the most fundamental concern facing many producers, certainly those that are more vulnerable and have less capital assets, is the stability. So initiatives that can provide secure access at a more secure price can indeed be worth a lot more to farmers over the longer term than higher yet more volatile prices. So it isn't as simple as how do we pay, but how do we actually make the sector economically attractive and viable through these different mechanisms. And I'll bring it back. It's not only about how do we provide the financing to make initiatives sustainable, but disincentivize those activities that are fundamentally unsustainable. And just to step back and close, the bigger elephant in the room in all of this, we've mentioned it a few times, is leakage. Leakage between regions, biomes, countries, commodities. It is relatively easy for Europe to clean up its supply chain with having potentially relatively little impact on reducing deforestation on the ground, simply by moving its supply base, which we referred to right at the start. So without a wider leveling of the playing field, without commensurate action taken elsewhere in other markets, efforts to incentivize good practice and fund more sustainable products and disincentivize bad practice will continue to be an uphill battle.
Thanks. We'll dive into that question of leakage a little bit in the discussion, I hope, Toby. So, Leandro, if I could sort of build on that, I mean, Toby talked about the importance of making progress on deforestation in a cross-commodity way, which I'm sure that we can all sort of endorse. So I suppose a question that arises from that is, well, why bother with these single commodity sort of supply chain approaches when lasting change on the ground only happens in a much more sort of complex way through working at landscape and jurisdictional initiatives? I mean, what's the point of working supply chain approaches at all? Shouldn't we be looking at those kind of more jurisdictional approaches?
Well, reducing deforestation it's a very complex problem, and there is no silver bullet. So there is no single solution to the problem that you can implement and apply everywhere. The most important thing is that we have urgency. We need to act fast. We need to act globally, and we need to use a portfolio of strategies and apply those where they are most effective. So for certain places, jurisdictional approaches are not going to be delivered quite quickly, especially if you're thinking about frontiers, areas that you don't have a lot of governance, like the wild west of deforestation in some places. That you are not going to set up have the conditions to set up jurisdictional landscape approaches, especially for places where one or two commodities are the main driver of deforestation. Those are the places where you probably the supply chains initiatives are going to be more effective. For places more consolidated, where you start having a better governance, jurisdictional and landscape approaches are probably going to be more effective, especially for places that have big diversity of economic activities and different crops and stuff like that. One single commodity is not going to make a lot of difference. So you need to have blended approaches, and you need to tailor your strategies to the place that you're working with. One thing that's also important to have in mind is that supply chain approaches is one lever that you can use. A lot of the jurisdictional approaches started with pressure from downstream in the supply chain. So in the end, it's a blended approach that's going to work better in most of the places.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to start pivoting towards the questions which are coming in. We've only got one question so far, so if more questions don't come in, I'm going to have the pleasure of actually asking the panelists questions myself, because it's not every day that I get such a cluster of experts sort of sitting together, and so I'm going to take advantage of that. But please feel free, if you're listening in, put more questions into the Q&A. Be as provocative as you like. So the first question is actually to Leandro. You mentioned an analysis that suggested that only about 7% of farmers would be affected by a deforestation commitment in the Cerrado. Can you give us a source for that?
Yeah, this is one of those that TNC did in the past, but I saw some similar analysis did by other organizations. The thing is that it's not really hard to get these numbers. For soy, what we did is to check all the properties that have soy, were producing soy in the Cerrado, and check how much vegetation they still have. And based on that data, we calculated how much they could legally deforest. And that's where the 7% of the farmers, the properties would be affected. So only 7% of the farms would have some vegetation that can be legally deforested. And we can do this kind of analysis for other commodities. It's not that hard with the level of information that we have in Brazil, but we could do the same thing in other frontiers like the Chaco or even in the Amazon. It's not so hard. The main thing is that the commitments are always created to prevent further deforestation. So what we are looking for is areas that can still have deforestation. We are not looking to the past deforestation.
Great, thank you. I'm actually going to ask a question which I think perhaps Leandro and Toby will be best placed to answer. So I'm kind of curious, how much time do we have on the deforestation issue? So if you look at the major producer biomes and you just project out sort of business as usual into the future, how much time do we have to prevent sort of irreparable biodiversity and carbon losses in places like the Amazon, the Chaco, or Indonesia?
The short answer, and I don't want to be glib about this, is no more time. We need to be doing all we can now. It's not that irreparable damage hasn't already occurred. Irreparable damage in some parts of all of the biomes we're talking about has already occurred. There are plenty of scientists that consider the Amazon is famously at or over a tipping point, which will make it harder to maintain lowland tropical rainforest in some areas on the eastern fringe, for example. The Cerrado and the Chaco biome that we talk about much less compared to the Amazon in Latin America is much more imperiled. The Atlantic rainforest is extremely imperiled. Now, it's not a primary location for the expansion of agricultural commodities across its extent, but in some places like Paraguay, for example, the Paraguayan Atlantic forest, which is biogeographically distinct in its own right, is extremely imperiled. There's hardly any of it left. So I think there's no, I mean, yesterday is the answer. There's no time to lose, really. And what we can say is that the longer we delay, and this is true, of course, of any action on climate, the longer we delay, the greater the costs and the greater the risk that the damage will be increasingly irreversible. So we have an agenda now. We have a step up. Whether it translates into a step change remains to be seen, but we have a step up in ambition, in sincerity, I think. It wasn't for nothing that COP26 placed forests and placed ecosystems in general at the heart of its discussions. It's no longer a fringe issue. It's no longer seen as a bonus issue. It's central to the success of the climate crisis, of the biodiversity crisis, and therefore, indeed, of the well-being of so many people. So let's get on. I think we've got enough information, and the work by groups such as this and events such as this have a key role to play.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Toby. So Natalie, question came in that I think is a good one for you. So what role do you see certification playing in the struggle against deforestation? And in particular, why is there no certification scheme for cattle when it's the biggest driver of deforestation?
Right. So I think the challenge with certification has really been uptake and market share. Certain commodities like palm oil, you have quite high market shares, and others it's lower, or there's a plethora of different systems and it becomes very confusing. I know some soy producers say they have to comply with 13 or even more different rules and standards. So I think that's been one issue, though. There are some thoughts that potentially with regulations like in the EU, which go beyond just legality, that certification may play a bigger role, because it's a way of having assurance for what producers can do. Though the EU has said that's not going to be an automatic sort of just if you're certified, you're fine. But it's likely that certification systems will adapt to these regulations and help compliance. But we have to see. In terms of cattle, there have been efforts. The Global Roundtable is sort of an overarching body that has many national roundtables for cattle, like Paraguay, Colombia, Brazil. But I think cattle is quite different from other commodities in that there are just so many different ways that they can be produced, ways that that cattle are raised. There's movements between ranches. It's just very complex. Whereas most crops, there's sort of certain similarities in how they're produced, and it's just you can have pasture-raised cattle and feedlot cattle and confinement. So it's just been very difficult to align. And then, of course, in addition to deforestation, there's many other issues that in terms of pollution, animal welfare issues. So it's just been very difficult to have an agreement. Rainforest Alliance for a while had a standard of more than 10 years ago, and it just wasn't taken up. So it's also that the market didn't care, and also that the beef sector is so bifurcated, right? Because the soy is sort of soy is soy, whereas I can buy, an expensive steak or pet food. So it's just a very diverse market and hard to sort of harmonize production.
Great. Shengen, if I could ask you a question about how relevant this whole issue is for China's climate change thinking. So we know China made an important pledge of climate neutrality by 2060. So how, if at all, is the question of deforestation and commodity imports being considered by Chinese policymakers as an issue that they need to address in that carbon neutrality pledge?
Yeah, well, this is not just $1 million question, probably $1 billion question. But China is committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. The researchers are really struggling to come up with different strategies to how we can achieve it. One tricky issue is how much China is going to import. Right? You can simply the other countries to produce carbon intense commodities to feed the Chinese market. But that's not an option for several reasons. One is China actually is quite concerned about high dependence on import of certain commodities, soybean, beef, and so on. So now the Chinese self-sufficiency rate of the whole food, it's not just rice and wheat, is probably less than 70%, sorry, less than 80%. And the projection shows that tendency probably will increase if we don't do something. So the strategy is to use more domestically. One is obviously to ensure that China has a food security, maintaining high sufficiency rate. The other is actually not to be blamed for importing and not to carbon intense products. So they are aware of that. So particularly soybean. So for soybean obviously is a very much hard commodity from US and Brazil. During the US-China trade war, China increased import of soybean from Brazil. So now that China developed a new, probably not future strategy of producing more soybean domestically through intercropping with maize, through more investment, research, increase the yield of soybean here in China, and also look for alternative proteins, not soybean, other beans, and also if the Chinese consumers eat less meat, they can eat soybean directly. That can save soybean by more than half, maybe even two-thirds. You need enough of soybean to produce animal proteins to meet our requirement. So I think the key here is innovations domestically, policy incentives for farmers to produce more. Right now, the farmers still have more incentive to produce more rice, more maize, because price is more favorable, and the yield of soybean is very low. So there are a couple of strategies in China. One is to intercrop between soybean and maize. The other is replace rice with soybean in certain parts of China. So replace rice with soybean is a good strategy because rice is a huge emitter of methane. So reducing methane from, let's say, rice planting area is good for carbon neutrality. But on the other hand, farmers may lose, farmers may lose certain, let's say, production, maybe 20%. So how are you going to compensate through carbon credit? For rice production, maybe in southern China, is it possible to use modern technologies like direct seeding or alternating between dry and wet, and also reduce methane quite a bit. Again, the yield may be compromised. So here we need to introduce the carbon market, have a smallholders. If the smallholders can sequestrate, reduce the carbon emissions or methane emissions, they need to be compensated. And the Chinese carbon price is very low right now, like $8 per ton. I wish that can be increased by 5 times or more, and gives this credit to farmers. Going back to you, David. So I think Chinese policymakers are aware, Chinese researchers are aware. I think China will continue to import, but not as fast as before.
Great.
Thank you. Point.
Thank you, Schengen. So there's a question come in. So some policies of governments on reducing deforestation use the idea of no net deforestation, which implies that some deforestation will be allowed in some areas if there's reforestation in other places. So do you see this as making monitoring too hard, or do you see advantages in this no net loss approach? Maybe I'll throw that to Leandro.
I think that a lot of this no net loss approaches is sometimes used by to stall or to not move progress forward. One of the things that is really important to have in mind is that once one area is the forest, this area, that place is lost. It not grows back, or even if you reforest, you're not going to have the same thing that you have before, both in a biological sense, and it also doesn't make sense in economical sense. Biologically, is to one area reforest needs to. Sometimes it takes decades or a century to become exactly to have the same biodiversity or provide the same environmental service that the original forest. And the thing is that restoration is very expensive. So it makes much more sense economically to not deforest and than to deforest and restore later, because it's too expensive. I'm not saying that reforestation restoration is not important. For some places that you still do that we are heavily deforested, like Atlantic forest, that you have really few remnants. Deforestation is especially important. But to use this as a policy to deforest in some places, to restore in others, doesn't make sense biologically or economically.
Thanks, Leandro. So I'm going to, while we're waiting for more questions to come through, I'm going to rotate through the panel and ask them the question which I'm constantly asking myself, which is, what are we missing? Like, we all spend a lot of time thinking about this problem. What is it that you feel is not being discussed or not as visible in the strategic discussion as it should be when it comes to thinking about how we can get deforestation down? So maybe I could ask Natalie to answer that first, and I'll just go in the order that I see people on my screen.
Ooh. That's a difficult one. There's obviously a lot we could be doing because we're not solving the problem. That, there's some smart thinking, but I think that it's been alluded to, but I think understanding the importance of data availability and transparency and how it can reduce costs would be important. And there's also a lot of sort of hidden pinch points that can be preventing solutions, such as unnecessary middlemen. I think I've heard about indirect suppliers and traders that can be making supply chains less transparent, and also could be a place where they, without them, could have more efficiency, better profitability, or more support, especially for smallholder producers. There's, in cattle, we've mentioned there's clandestine production. So there's efforts where forest governance and better governance can go hand in hand better in terms of synergies with supply chain approaches, because we've heard there's concerns about supply chain approaches sort of favoring the bigger actors who are best positioned to adapt. But if those can be part of deforestation-free supply chains that can be checked quite more easily, especially by sort of exporters and importing countries, and then that can allow governments to sort of focus on the areas that are harder for supply chains to reach. I think there's a synergistic approach. So instead of looking at sort of should governments or the private sector act, just sort of recognizing where they can work together. But I would say that the hook in terms of data is really important, because that's what gets us from farm by farm, small scale approaches to be able to really scale up. And if the data can be made available, it's free if it's already being collected. And so just harnessing that would be helpful, I think.
Toby.
I appreciate this question very much, David. My first reaction is, I think one thing that's missing from a lot of the discussions, and it's been present in some of our discussion today, is frankly honesty. I think we hoodwink ourselves about certain solutions being possible to gain scale because they're on the shelf, we reach for them. Certification, for example, has a key role to play, but it's inherently unscalable for certain commodities in certain markets. And we shouldn't kid ourselves otherwise. Blockchain has a key role to play, but it's rolled out as this silver bullet solution to all of our problems, ignoring the simple fact that it suffers from the same problem of all information systems: rubbish in, rubbish out. So let's stop. Sometimes we're lacking the honesty just because we're lacking the facts, or the conversations are too rushed. Sometimes I think it's a little disingenuous on the part of some actors to obfuscate the scale of the challenge we face. So more honesty. The other thing I think is a genuine raising of the floor. Now we're starting to see that with the proposed regulations, but they're not in place yet. So businesses are crying out, and producers are crying out, and external observers are crying out for unsustainable products to be priced out of the market or closed out of the market, and sustainable products to be given a fair price. We will only achieve that if the floor is raised sufficiently, and if it continues to ratchet up. So voluntary measures, if you like, can represent the ceiling. We need a constant ratcheting of the floor raised as the ceiling and the ambition is raised. Otherwise, we'll stagnate and we'll risk cycling down to a lowest common denominator. And linked to this, so that's something the governments need to be, and they're starting. But as per earlier conversation, we need to get on with this. What I'd say on business is a much greater embracing, a more enthusiastic embracing of moving more of the sustainability challenges we face, which are not peripheral, they're central they're existential to some sectors, especially if you look at sectors like cocoa, where climate change is an existential threat to the productivity of cocoa in many parts of the world, including West Africa, where most of it comes from. Move more of those issues into a pre-competitive space. It's frustrating, to put it mildly, to see how often discussions within businesses are prefaced by NDAs or other mechanisms that close down rather than open up the bringing in of many of these issues, which of course concretely refer to the sharing of some kinds of information. We all recognize that we need to move from independent supply chain action to collective supply chain action. We need to move away from supply chains to suppliers. We need to move over time towards recognizing entire regions or even entire sectors to give confidence and move them to a new level. We'll only do that if more of that takes place in a pre-competitive space. And then the final point, to re-emphasize what Natalie said, which is about information disclosure. I think governments need to do a lot more. So there was a forest agriculture commodity task force ahead of COP26, and the Transparency and Traceability Working Group, the main recommendation it made was to come with a more harmonized set of disclosure expectations on governments. And one of the data sets that doesn't need to be entirely transparent, but at least needs to be available in some form, is more information on per shipment level trade data. And the EU is actually one of the least transparent parts of the world with regards to that. So there's a lot of emphasis and expectation placed on companies. Let's see a bit more governments. I like Shingen's point on G2G. There's so much we can do there. Let's place more emphasis on governments to start sharing and harmonizing some of these data sets, and recognizing that actually in places like Brazil, there are extraordinary levels of information disclosure that would never see the light of day in places like the US. I'll leave it there. That's a shopping list for you.
Thank you, Toby. Schengen, what's your take? What are we missing?
Yeah, I think many issues have been discussed for the last 20, 30 years. On Amazon, and also diversity. And this from this discussion, the two things are missing. One is the macroeconomic issues. I think that the root cause of deforestation actually is underdevelopment, is somewhere in Brazil. I mean, if Brazil moves towards more prosperity, or the smallholders can move to the cities in the city life, and the pressure on the forestry will be much smaller. Through migration, through better jobs. I think that's one thing we needed to discuss more. You will see that deforestation is very much associated with underdevelopment. That's number one. Number two is actually consumers. Not necessarily consumers should be aware of deforestation. I think that consumers should be aware in general of their behavior, consumption behavior. So what we eat right now, particularly in Western countries and emerging economies, are not healthy and not sustainable. We simply eat too much and too much red meat. That causes, let's say, not only our health problem, huge cost of bill covered by that, but also huge environmental costs, including deforestation, including climate change. So I think two bigger issues going beyond the beef, soybean supply chains or palm oil supply chains. We have helped to solve bigger issues at a bigger scale. Going back to David.
Thanks. And Leandro, what are we missing from your perspective?
Well, it's hard to be the last in a panel like this with this quality of panelists, because I think that there is not much else to say. I would just emphasize I think two things. One is that something that I already mentioned, and I think it's really important, is that it's not that there is a solution that we didn't see, and we need to find out what it is. I think that's all already on the table, but I think it's important to emphasize that it's not going to be a single solution, a silver bullet. It's going to be blended approaches that are going to be effective, and then we need to tailor them to each place. And the other thing is we need to start to pricing in externalities in the production of products, and that's going to be the only way to really use the market power to start reducing the footprint of the commodities that we produce. Things like if we can establish like carbon border taxes that really work, and we can include start selecting sources and places based on the quality of the sustainability of the production than anything else.
Okay, so I think we have exhausted the questions that have been coming in. I think we've had a great sort of thorough discussion of the issues. I'm afraid we just lost Schengen. I suspect because of some connection issues, because there were some difficulties with the quality of the sound of his last contribution. So I would like to thank all of the panelists. Really appreciated your input. I hope that for those listening, this was both informative and provocative. And thanks very much for everyone's attendance, and let's keep thinking and working on this incredibly important issue. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Bye.